Well, hello and welcome to the Everything Sequel podcast. This is actually our introduction. My name is Mike Shantz of the How Dare You Awards. With me, as always, will be Tom Steward of Lonesome Whistle Productions. Say hello, Tom.
Believe the hype. It's a sequel.
That's exactly right. The Everything Sequel podcast is the podcast in which we look at movie sequels. We don't even dare to deal with the originals, the sequels only. Isn't that right, Tom?
Yeah, I think if there's a metaphor for this podcast, it's that we cut the head off the snake and watch it wriggle to a slow death.
And the funny part about that is usually that's the best one. But we are going to cut that head off and we are going to watch it die so that we can talk about what most people would describe as the inferior movies. But you know, Everything Sequel is your brainchild. I know you've talked about why you wanted to do this and the idea of looking at sequels specifically. So tell me about that.
Well, for a lot of years now, most of the movies that get released, at least in commercial big budget cinema, are some kind of sequel. And so I wanted to do a dedicated sequel podcast that embraces that. I think we're still sort of stuck in the mentality of treating sequels as the poor relations, the redheaded stepchild of
right.
Of the original movie, and that seems a very strange thing to be doing when the bulk of our diet cinematically now is
so much of it, right?
Yeah, it seems a strange thing to do. You know, on a weekly basis we're getting sequels, so
right. Well, and I know that one of the things that you've talked about, or at least we've talked about together, that you wanted to sort of get across with this podcast is the idea of looking at each movie separately as an individual movie, and
yes,
the idea of that movie on its own merits, correct?
Yes, it's a fine line between looking at how these movies tell a story across them, but also how do they stand up as an individual work of art, right. And I think
is art a loosely based term, do you think, or
art is a work of art is a term of art.
Okay.
As in that might not necessarily be true.
As in what an artistic choice of you to make to use the word art.
Well, I think these movies do grow when you adopt that perspective, and a lot of them are worth seeing as worth talking about as individual movies. But
I think all movies are worth talking about, even if they're bad.
Well, I agree.
I love talking about movies. That's why I'm here. You told me about the Everything Sequel podcast idea, and that just tickled me to my core. Like, I wanted in. I was, gung-ho for us to start this.
Well, quite. And I think it's interesting because, we're not starting with the assumption that these are bad movies, but that assumption will exist about the majority of them.
Right.
So it's going to be interesting how we deal with that particular dilemma each time.
Well, and it is hard to separate each sequel from the original movie because, these things are sort of in our consciousness, the law of diminishing returns and the idea that they just get worse as they go along. And, and often because it's true, too. Like, that does happen a lot. So, but I really love the idea of looking at each movie individually and taking it on its own merits because I love movies that much. I try to see as many movies in the theater as I can because that's where they're supposed to be seen and that's where I like to see them.
Yeah, well, not to jump too far ahead, our first case study is going to be the Superman sequels.
What a great
And,
place to start.
And what you just said put me in mind of John Cryer, who appears in the
Yes.
Superman 4.
As the poor man's Ned Beatty, which I'm sure we'll discuss.
Who's apparently sneaked into a sneak peek of Superman 4 and couldn't even stay in the movie theater the entire time. So that's that.
He's
that's
like, I paid for my roof. I'm out of here.
Yeah. Well, quite, yeah, and I think so. It's interesting, how these movies stand up. I mean, there is definitely, we're not going to pretend that a lot of the movies we're looking at are trying to capitalize on the success and the quality of the original movie, but often the ways in which that they're failing to do that
are the most interesting thing about them.
The most interesting things, about them are these choices of but every sequel is trying to recreate the magic of the original, but it's also trying to up the ante as well.
Right.
And they make some very strange, ludicrous choices.
Well, and you often find
outdoing the original.
Yeah, you often find that filmmakers who didn't have a lot of money for an original movie and have to get really creative in the way they make that movie. When that movie's a huge success and all of a sudden they're given a bunch of money, somehow it doesn't work, So, there's plenty of things to chop up. Every single week, my dear listeners, we are going to talk about a set of sequels. We'll chop them up so that they are easily digestible. For instance, Tom mentioned we are going to start with the Superman series, so we'll have an episode on Superman 2, an episode on Superman 3, and an episode of Superman 4. Whenever we start one, we will have some fun games for you where you can play along with us, because at the beginning of each series, we will discuss best to worst. We're going to order those movies from best to worst in order. We're going to then talk about which movie is good and which movie is bad. You have to declare definitively, is this movie good or bad?
Why are we doing that, Michael?
Well, here's the thing. This is where you separate the good from the bad and the bad from the ugly. Because in our first movie, let's take as an example, Superman. We're going to talk about the Superman sequels. Most people think Superman 2 is an excellent movie. Most people, I think, will say Superman 4, ooh, that's a flaming piece of shit. But Superman 3 is where it gets interesting. So, dear listeners, what you can do is you can start sending in your opinions to us at some point, and you can tell us what you think. Tom and I are going to fight over whether or not some of these movies are good or bad, I'm sure. But the idea is Superman 3, this is where you separate, and this is where you draw the line of demarcation in the sand, and somebody has to pick a side as to whether or not this is a good movie or a bad movie.
And I'll put my cards on the table right now. I am a sucker for a sequel that tries to do something different from its predecessor. I'm
fascinated already, sir.
I am willing to overlook a lot of problems for a movie. Let's call it Babe Pig in the City syndrome. I am willing to overlook a lot if there is a genuine attempt to say, we're going to do things differently. What is irrelevant now.
Oh, I can't wait to talk to you about it. I can't wait for you all to listen to it. I can't wait for you to tell us what you think of what we think of it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Everything Sequel podcast. We're going to have a lot of fun. Don't you think, Tom?
We are indeed, and I think one of the it's worth sticking around to the end, because at the very end of these episodes, or at least at the end of every film series we cover, we're going to pitch our own sequels.
That's right. Preach, my friend. Preach.
And we're gonna we are going to outline where we think the series is going next,
where it should go.
Create a fantasy sequel, a sequel that can never exist. We can pull from any period in history, well, at least within the timeline of the films. We're not going to have. Thomas Edison isn't going to appear in our sequels, or
certainly not to a Superman
Mark,
sequel.
Mark Twain, unless there's a time travel component, which because it's a sequel, there probably will be. But we're gonna pitch those sequels, and we're gonna try and create the ultimate fantasy follow up to the movie series we've ever seen, and hopefully we can talk about abandoned storylines, characters that have disappeared, relationships and story arcs that never came to fruition. We could just be proposing a movie that does a kind of Alien 3 job and just kills off everything that you've previously seen.
Right.
So let's look forward to that.
Well, and my favorite idea behind the Pitch the Sequel segment is that you, our listeners, can start voting on which sequel you'd like to see, and then we can see a little running total, Tom. We'll have a little battle between you and me.
Yeah, if you want to call it a battle. So.
Well, one way or another, we're going to
foregone conclusion is my term.
One way or another, dear listeners, you are going to have a good time. We're going to hash out these sequels. You're going to relearn to love them, whether they are good, bad, or not. Something in between, maybe. We're going to be talking about these movies, and we look forward to you listening to us. Say goodbye, Tom.
Farewell. Until the next time.
That is all. We'll see you next time. Thank you.